now to discuss about the Prague Summit with the foreign ministers coming in from all around the world. We're going to bring in Mark Toth, national and foreign security experts. Good afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us at TVP World.
Marie, Ben, good afternoon. Good to see you.
So just before we dive into our conversation, I'd like us to listen to Mr. Gabrielius Landsbergis, Lithuanian Minister of Foreign Affairs. He made a powerful statement earlier today. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The time is coming when it will be determined whether we as an alliance are serious. And serious about quite a lot of things. Are we serious about assisting Ukraine to win this war? Are we serious to deter Russia so that Russia has strategic dilemmas if it continues further in Ukraine, but also if it continues with its hybrid activities in Europe and in NATO? If we're serious about inviting new members? Because we have been quite good at speaking nice words, making promises, but we have to start delivering on this. And it's not just about those who depend on our promises, but it's also about our credibility. And I wish that this alliance will find strength in itself. And as celebrating 75 years of anniversary, also very clearly declares that yes, we are serious, we can win, we can deter, and we can invite new members. That's my hope for today and also for Washington.
So I think Landsbergis, he said what is on a lot of people's minds. I think he made it clear that we're actually not only focusing on the war in Ukraine, but also a hybrid warfare, a hybrid war that is expanding and escalating very, very quickly and affecting many countries at the same time. I was wondering what your thoughts were about this meeting that is happening in Prague at the moment, and in particular the fact that many countries now are declaring their permission, shall we say, or their willingness to use these Western secured weapons in Russian territory.
Marie, in terms of Landsberg, really welcome statement by him. I mean, he's essentially calling for what I've called for a long time, for NATO to find its backbone. And certainly yesterday was a terrific first step in that direction. When I was on TVP World yesterday, we didn't quite know yet how forceful NATO and its allies would come out in terms of greenlighting the use of U.S.-made weapons, and then individual member states, some haven't. You know, for instance, Italy has declined to allow theirs to be used. But for the most part, even Germany was coming on board and saying that their weapon systems could be used in and around Kharkiv. So yesterday was a great first step. I think yesterday also, kind of at higher altitude, really was just kind of a collective situation where Brussels and people in Washington finally were saying, like what General McCauley did at Bastogne during World War II, this is all nuts, and that we can't keep yielding and creating a sanctuary inside of Russia for Putin's forces to attack and level Kharkiv. So thankfully, we have all said nuts. And now we're seeing the alliance lean into winning. And then I can get into a little bit, but you're absolutely right, Marie, to bring up the asymmetrical warfare that Putin is increasing across the European continent.
I think one of the big contributions about America reaching this conclusion is the fact that the European nations within NATO can present a unified front when making this argument. And a lot of people are calling this informal NATO summit one that is a warm-up for the Washington summit. Do you think by that time the European Union countries can also provide this same unified front to achieve some of these goals that Landsbergis has listed out, which seems to be pretty ambitious?
You know, Ben, it's a great question. I hope so. I think, as I mentioned yesterday on TVP World, I was really hopeful that this informal foreign ministers meeting in Prague in the Czech Republic would take on the importance that the 1943 conference did in Casablanca between Roosevelt and FDR, when finally a strategy was developed to win. Now, we're not there yet, but certainly yesterday and today in Prague, we're seeing the West, Brussels, NATO, and even Washington starting to lean into winning. Now, between now and when that summit happens, the formal summit happens in Washington, D.C., we really do need to see Brussels and Washington collectively come together, whether it's NATO, EU, or even a partnership of individual member states of the willing to come into a winning strategy, because the strategy to date has been proving that it's not winning. It's stagnating at best, but arguably, as I've mentioned before here on TVP World, it's starting to become a losing strategy in the sense that Ukraine was losing momentum on the battlefields and Russia was starting to gain very marginal increases, forward increases on the battlefield, but they were gaining in the PR war and the perception that they were winning. And I think nowhere more so than in Beijing, because Beijing now sees blood in the water, and I think they're more willing to be open about supporting Russia with lethal aid, and we're seeing evidence of that growing support of Beijing, of Putin, simply by refusing to attend the upcoming peace conference in Switzerland.
But just to follow up, you say that now we're, essentially achieving or hitting another level of this war. Excuse me. But would you not say that what is happening now is a signal of some sort of escalation?
Absolutely, Marie, because you've hit, that's the key word. I think there are two words that when I write my columns with Colonel John Sweet, and I know when we're both on TVP World, we keep saying the same two words, escalation paralysis in terms of what has gripped Washington, this fear that somehow this conflict will go nuclear and Putin can play that card every time and knows how to play it. The other word was interdiction, the idea that we're just letting Ukraine get hit and hit and hit. And Putin has intentionally targeted Ukrainian civilians as a means of keeping air defense systems back, protecting Kiev, protecting population centers, and not having them forward placed on the battlefield. And we were in danger, right? Kharkiv was in danger of being leveled because Ukrainian forces couldn't use the weapons they had that would be effective in deterring Russian artillery and forces massing on the other side of that border. So, that it is groundbreaking. Make no mistake of that. But right now, it's still limited. I mean, you still hear it caged in terms of just in and around. But, for me as a military analyst who wants to see Ukraine win, we've got to take that next step. And in my mind, okay, fine, we've taken an important first step here in addressing some of the military madness, which was so nuts about not being able to interdict those missiles, to now we need to be taking steps to make sure that the West, whether it's NATO or a partnership of the willing of individual member states, starts to protect Ukrainian civilians, because Putin is intentionally targeting them. And that's why, last week in the Hill, John Sweet and I called for a no-fly zone, that we've just seen enough, at least in Western Ukraine, if ideally not more.
All right, you brought up a very good point, and I'd like to reiterate the terminology that you were using just now, that the NATO allies are finally leaning into winning, and I think that's very important going into the Washington summit. So I would like to ask you, what kind of decisive actions would you like to see the NATO partners pursue after that summit?
Ben, $10 million question, right? It's a good one. In no particular order, I think by the time they get to Washington, NATO needs to be sorting a lot of different things out. And I jotted some down, so forgive me if I look down for a couple of notes. I mean, I think first and foremost was that Financial Times report that NATO believes that it only has about 5% of its ability to cover, from an air defense standpoint, key targets throughout the NATO alliance. That has to change. We need to see a rapid increase of air defense systems, the manufacturing of them, the strategic placement of them, et cetera. I mean, that's just smart preventative defensive warfare. We also need to be seeing NATO understanding more the asymmetrical warfare that Putin, Marie brought this up earlier, the asymmetrical warfare that Putin is starting to wage across Europe. We see that in sabotage and spying, influence peddling, trying to bribe journalists and politicians, even assassinations, as well as, the increasing cyber attacks, of which just before I came on, you were reporting about that already happening in 2022 and 2023 with Polish and other Eastern European journalists. So, that's another key thing. I mean, we're back in that world of James Bond, not to make light of it, but kind of the reality of it. I think that also entails overall, that means the West has to go on more of a war footing, not looking for offensive war, but being prepared to fight one. Because Donald Tusk was right when he shortly came, I think it was shortly after he came into office, but he warned that Europe, and Eastern Europe in particular, was basically on the eve of a much wider war with Russia. And that means preparing for it. And so it's not just a question of GDP expenditure, how much you're spending. It's a question of what kinds of capabilities you are buying. And your Eastern Shield is a good first step, as I mentioned the other day on TVP World. But it also has to have a counterstrike capability so that that Eastern Shield is the last line of defense, not the first. In other words, you don't want to be in that same situation as Poland, nor the Baltic states, for instance, and your other partners in that shield of being where Ukraine was at in Kharkiv, where those masses were taking place, but you couldn't interdict them or didn't have the capabilities to. And so that means upping your own numbers of ATACMS, long-range artillery, et cetera, so that Russia gets it, that if they forward position forces to threaten Poland or the Baltic states, you have the means of deterring it. So, kind of all of those things, combined with an overall winning strategy that results in Ukraine finally being able to win, and being able to win by retaking the Crimea Peninsula, because that will be the decisive terrain of this war. So those are the things that really need to come about now. We've started to lean into winning, Ben, but now we need to have the winning strategy that assures that we do.
All right, thank you so much for your input and insight. Thanks again for being with us on TVP World. That was Mark Toth, national security and foreign policy expert. Thank you so much.
Great. Always a pleasure, Ben. Marie, take care.
And now we're going to go to Alex Simlinski, who has the latest headlines from around the world.